So I've just watched Black Death for the second time. It's directed by Christopher Smith, who's a British director who I'm not particularly a fan of. He's directed a few movies like Creep from 2004, he did Severance, which is kind of a horror comedy, and he did Triangle, which is kind of a mind-bending, I don't even know what you'd call it. I wasn't keen. I admire Triangle a little bit, but wasn't keen. He directed this movie from a screenplay by Dario Poloni. I don't know anything about Dario Poloni, but he wrote the screenplay himself, and then Christopher Smith kind of came in as director and changed some things around, which I'll talk about in a second. Despite having a British director and writer and mostly British cast members, it's actually a German production. It was financed in Germany and filmed in Germany. It's set in 1348 at the height of the Black Plague, and it's basically about rumours of a village that's immune to the plague. And so a group of men have to go on a mission to investigate this and basically to punish these heathens who think they're above the plague. It's an interesting idea. I think I like how the movie makes us question whether or not a village could be above catching the plague and the methods by which they could have achieved this. There's mention that the village is ruled by a necromancer, and so the movie kind of makes us question whether that's actually a possibility. The main characters are played by Eddie Redmayne and Sean Bean. Eddie Redmayne's character is called Osmond. He's a novice monk, but he's having something of a crisis of faith. He's having an affair with a woman that he shouldn't be having, and he basically believes this quest to this village is God's personal mission for him, and also a way of reuniting with this woman who's had to flee because the village has been afflicted by the plague. Sean Bean's character, Ulrich, is a knight serving a bishop, and he's basically been given this as a religious mission to punish the heathens. Sean Bean's character is more interesting to me. He basically comes across like he wants to show that Christianity is the solution to the plague and that the plague wasn't delivered by God. It's not his wrath, it's a product of the devil. And this village that is run by heathens who don't believe in God and have renounced their faith are not the answer, and they're not a real sanctuary. I've seen this movie described as a horror adventure movie. The first movie that comes to mind when I think of horror adventure is The Descent, which starts as an adventure movie about going caving, and then it turns into an action sort of schlock horror movie towards the end. And that's kind of what Black Death is. It has a lot of, well, not a lot of action, but it has action scenes. There's a great scene sort of half an hour in where there's just loads of bloody, pulpy violence, which is great. But it's also a movie about travelling across the country and discovering something that you don't really want to discover. I also thought it was a clever choice by the screenwriter to make the dialogue sound old-fashioned but not inaccessible to the audience.
What is her crime? She brought death to our village.
Death is all around us. It needs no invitation.
This does not involve you, monk. Step aside!
It didn't go full The Witch. It didn't just turn the dialogue into, old period talk. It wasn't like Of Mice and Men or something. It was dialogue that we can understand as an audience, but it felt dated enough that it represented that time period. Something I wasn't keen on was the fact that it only really felt like the two main characters, Osmond and Ulrich, were actual characters. They go on this journey with a sort of a band of knights and, robbers and murderers and stuff. They worked well as a unit, but not as individuals. The cinematography of this movie is really nice. There is an issue, I think, with some of the handheld nature, where there are certain close-up shots of people that are really sort of wobbly, and it just doesn't feel right for this kind of movie. It feels like if the camera had been just set down and it was just filming everything nice and slow and sort of calm, I feel like that would have benefited the movie more, and there are shots like that in the movie, and those are some of the best scenes, visually speaking. But some of the best cinematography in the movie comes from the landscape shots and some of the just really natural ancient scenery of Germany, which looks really nice and really benefits the movie. It gives it this kind of epic, almost Lord of the Rings kind of feeling. The villains who rule this village that's immune to the plague are played by Caris Van Houten and Tim McInerney. I like both these actors in their roles, but I think Caris Van Houten had more to do. She felt like the main villain of the piece, and Tim McInerney, he's a great actor, he's solid in this movie, but he was just stood there the whole time wasting potential, when Caris Van Houten was really quite sinister. I like that when the group arrived, she immediately identified Osmond as the weakest, or having, a crisis of faith. So she started planting these seeds of doubt in his mind and sort of manipulating him a little bit. I found that to be quite sinister and quite clever, but Tim McInerney could have done more. I've seen this movie before, and both then and this time, the point at which I started to fall out with the movie was towards the final sort of half an hour, 40 minutes, when everyone's taken captive and they're basically just being sacrificed one by the village folk. It was very melodramatic, it was very over the top, and there's lots of music blaring and people yelling. It felt like the movie could have been more subtle, and it also felt like that whole sequence could have been shorter. It really, it kind of sucks all the drama out of the situation when it's so prolonged and so over the top. As I mentioned before, the original script by Dario Poloni was reworked by the director Christopher Smith. The original script was supernatural in nature. Basically, there is actually a necromancer in the village, and there is witchcraft at work. The script was changed by Smith, who felt like a setting like the Black Death and, the medieval England was horrific enough and didn't need that supernatural element. I feel like that is to the benefit of the movie, but at the same time, it doesn't really do much with convincing you that this is real life. It poses all these questions about, is there a supernatural element at play? At the end, it kind of just dumps the revelation on you that actually the whole thing has just been real life. There is no witchcraft involved, and that just kind of feels a little unearned. By the end, Osmond's love interest has been killed by the main villain, well, in a way that's orchestrated by her. And he basically turns into Ulrich, the Sean Bean character, where he becomes vengeful and just full of spite and starts presuming that everyone is a witch. And he starts going on this vengeful hunt for Caris Van Houten's character, which I liked. It was quite a grim ending, but it felt in line with the themes of the movie. Tonally, it has a lot of folk horror elements, I think, but there are much more effective folk horror movies out there. In my head, I keep comparing it to The Witch. The Witch is a far superior movie, but it has that similar feeling of being set in a time that's very simple, very puritanical, and it's much more about the evil within people than it is supernatural evil, although The Witch is a supernatural movie. But it feels like the supernatural elements in that movie are much more simple and grounded, and it's more about exposing how people are rather than how evil witchcraft is or anything. And that's why the Black Death kind of reminds me of The Witch a little bit. The whole theme with the movie is basically, how do men of God justify their violent, awful acts that they commit? It's quite an interesting theme, but I feel like this has been dealt with in other movies better, particularly Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. It's an old movie, and obviously it's a very different kind of movie. It's not a horror, it's not really an adventure. It's not anything like that, there's no action in it. It's nothing like Black Death, content-wise. But in terms of its themes and its kind of the characters and the journey that they go through, it's very similar, but it deals with those themes in a much more thoughtful and kind of meditative way than something like Black Death, which feels like it had those ideas, but it didn't know how to really explore them properly. So this might be a little bit of a quicker video than normal. I just wanted to get my thoughts out on a movie that I've just watched, and I also want to get my thoughts out on a movie that I'm not particularly keen on. It's a fine movie. I'd give it maybe a 6 out of 10. It's above average, but I don't think it really meshes together. So thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing for more.